I'm Rick Green, and I cover the Capitol for the Oklahoman and News OK. And I'm here today with Mark Hammons, the head of the Democratic State Party in Oklahoma. Welcome, Mark.
Well, thank you. Nice to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your background professionally and educationally, and what brought you to the position you're in now.
Well, I'm an attorney. I went to law school at OCU, did my undergraduate work in the business college at OU, served in the Oklahoma legislature, so I've been active in politics in various degrees for a long time, and then was elected as chairman of the party in May, the very end of May of last year.
And since you've taken over, it seems like we've heard a lot more from the Democratic Party. Is that intentional, more of a proactive role now?
It is intentional. We think that we have a message that resonates with the people or the population as a whole, not just on partisan lines, but in the sense of good government and managing an effective government. And we have focused on trying to get that message across. So yes, it is intentional.
And of course, in Oklahoma right now, the pendulum has swung all the way over to the Republican side, a state that used to be majority Democratic in terms of elected officials. Now every statewide office, every federal office associated with Oklahoma, each branch of the legislature it's dominated by Republicans. What are your hopes for the Democratic Party in turning that around?
Well, obviously we're focused primarily at the state level, and our hopes are that in 2018 there's going to be a Democratic governor and a number of Democratic statewide elected officials, and that we will move back to a majority position in one or both houses of the legislature. And I think there's good reason for us to be optimistic and believe that that will come to pass in light of the elections that have taken place since I've been chairman.
Do you see a trend in that regard?
Well, yes, I do. There have been 4 special elections in 2015 into the early part of 2016. 2 of those elections are in traditionally Democratic areas in the House and the Senate. We retained both of those seats, but 2 of the elections were in traditionally heavily Republican districts. And in Oklahoma City, Cindy Munson won, took over a seat that had been held by the Republican Party for 50 years. J.J. Dossett won the Senate seat in Owasso, which is an overwhelmingly Republican Senate district. I think that's a reflection that although the Republicans took over in 2010, all of the statewide state offices from governor down and had huge majorities in both houses of the legislature, the fruits of their policies have not been good for the state. We can't go a day without a story about budget shortfalls, revenue failures, the declining state of our public education system, the problems in rural hospitals, the problems with rural roads and bridges, all of which we've taken money from, not we, but the Republicans have. And it's going to get worse because now the expected shortfall is $1.3 billion, the largest in history as far as I know. And it's all owned by the Republicans. It was engineered by them in terms of their fiscal plan, and that fiscal plan has failed.
Isn't it generally acknowledged, though, that the oil bust has a little something to do with the budget hole, that the general fund receipts have come down significantly in the various tax levels as the oil industry has shed employees?
Well, there's no doubt that that plays a part in it. But part of it is the way the Republicans have structured taxes, including on production taxes. They have created basically an unstable political financial model for the state to operate under, where all of our eggs depended upon continuing oil booms. And we all know that the oil industry has been boom or bust. You know, it's not all just one thing. So now you've taken away the ability to rely on a fairly structured income tax system, which is one of the three prongs. The oil industry is down, so you're having to manage the finances of the state on one prong, sales tax essentially, and some fees and revenues. That's not a sound plan. The Republicans did that in Kansas, and it failed in Kansas. And that's not due just to the oil boom and oil bust. It is just not a good economic plan. It doesn't fairly allocate the obligations of the state as a whole to meet the needs of the state as a whole.
But can you pin all that on the Republicans, given that there's been 10 years of income tax reductions, including significant ones under Democratic Governor Brad Henry?
Yeah, there have been income tax reductions under Democrats. Not to the extent that we have seen, and there's a point at which you have to recognize that you can't keep cutting that, or you're going to eliminate a source of revenue. And that's the problem, because the problems with the income tax that we've seen have occurred under the 6 years that the Republicans have controlled the state House, the state Senate, the governor's mansion, and the state executive offices on down. Nobody's going to say that you couldn't or shouldn't cut taxes when you can, but you've got to have a plan to do that, and you've got to decide the realities. Texas, for instance, which doesn't have an income tax, has property taxes that are about 2.5 to 3 times as large as Oklahoma's. So we didn't have a plan to say, well, we're going to shift our burden to property owners, and they're going to pay a lot more taxes on their property. We simply cut without a plan, and now our educational system is in crisis, our roads are in crisis, rural health care system is in crisis, and our overall budget is in crisis.
Are there other issues as well that the Democrats seek to emphasize in going up against Republican candidates?
Well, yeah. One of the things, and one of the reasons why many Republicans are crossing over and voting for Democrats is not just the financial irresponsibility, but the fact that this Republican administration has really focused on taking power away from the counties, the cities, and the local school districts. We have seen the governor intervene to take away the power of counties and cities to determine a fair wage within the communities, to regulate smoking, of all things, within the communities, and of course to regulate the development of injection wells within communities, so that the people who would best know the needs of the community don't get to decide what have traditionally been local issues. The governor's talking about consolidating statewide elected offices so that she can appoint that. At one time, the Republican Party supposedly was for small local government, but this Republican Party in Oklahoma has been for consolidating power in the hands of the governor and taking it away from local communities. We believe that's a bad decision. We believe that decisions are best made at the local level. So in that regard, the Democratic policy has flipped with that of the Republicans. Now they're the party of big government in the state of Oklahoma.
The state of Oklahoma elections for president, no Democrat has been supported since Lyndon Johnson. Do you see that changing anytime soon?
I don't know. 2016 is going to be awfully interesting because it's not certain who the Democratic nominee will be. At one time, I think everyone would have predicted Hillary Clinton. Certainly, there's a lot of grassroots support for Bernie Sanders, and I think the primary race will be very close here. On the other side, on the Republicans, I don't think anyone knows who the Republican nominee will be. So a lot of that is a question of people choosing between which of those candidates comes closer to their views. And until we know who the candidates will be, it's hard to say. But you know, some of the Republican candidates have taken positions that I think don't play well with the mainstream public. So, you know, I don't know if Trump's the nominee. I don't know if Oklahoma would vote for Trump.
Well, it's been such an unusual year for a candidate like Donald Trump, who doesn't have the political experience, and some of his issues and policy points are often questioned as to whether they would be credible or realistic. But on the Democratic side, Bernie gets questioned just as much. And so to have somebody, to have a possible Bernie versus Trump race,
it'd be an interesting
how do we
race.
get to a place like this?
Well, you know, quite frankly, I think on both sides, on the Republican and the Democratic side, Trump is viewed as a voice of change, not an insider. And although Bernie Sanders is a U.S. Senator and has served, you know, for a long time, he's viewed as an outsider, someone who doesn't necessarily go along with, you know, what the Democrats have to say, who is more independent in his voting patterns. And I think it is a message that people are tired of traditional politics and would like to see a change. Whether you consider yourself a conservative, a moderate, or liberal, that does seem to be a theme throughout.
Does it have anything to do with the polarization of the political process in recent years?
I think it does. I think everybody is fed up, or should be fed up, with the bickering and extreme partisanship that has taken place in Congress and between Congress and the White House over the past at least 6 years. It's not good for the country. And at some point in time, there ought to be someone who runs for office with the position of simply saying, let's do the right thing, let's do what's best for Oklahoma, let's do what's best for the country at the national level. And we just haven't seen enough of that. Whichever policies you agree with, it seems like we cannot have a civil dialogue, and that's a problem.
Do you see the same thing happening on the state level, where politicians will support certain issues not because they necessarily make sense in the real world, but because their political philosophy demands that they do so?
Yes, unfortunately. Now, of course, in the State House, you've got 71 out of 101 representatives who are Republicans. You've got 39 out of the 48 state senators who are Republicans. So it's not fighting among themselves, but it's to an extent avoiding the real problems. If you're going to support the growth of Oklahoma as a state as a whole, you can't ignore rural Oklahoma. That means you've got to have health care, you've got to have roads. Those are issues that are important. We need to have a public school system that is good enough so that quality companies will come here because they know that there will be a good workforce and that their managers can send their kids to schools that will give them a good education. And yet we see, I don't remember exactly how many it was, 18 bills on various gay rights issues. Now, the truth of the matter is, and the people in the legislature know this, that was decided by the Supreme Court, by Republican Supreme Court, in an opinion written by a Republican Supreme Court justice, appointed by a Republican president. That's not going to change at Oklahoma. When they engage in that, that's a smoke and mirrors tactic. They're telling people, well, you don't approve of this social issue, so we're going to make that the point of what we are focusing on, even though we actually can't do anything about that. That would have to be done at the national level. That's not good government. The Republican Party ought to be telling people how they're going to solve the educational crisis, because that affects every Oklahoman, and they can do something about that. They ought to be saying, this is what we're going to do to build up the infrastructure of this state, our roads and our highways, so that we can have people get from point A to point B and recruit businesses, that we're going to maintain our health care system and improve it and cover more Oklahomans instead of fewer Oklahomans. And they're not. They've abdicated the responsibility for leading the state and have simply given in to kind of showmanship. We think this will ring a bell with some people, so we'll talk about it, even though we cannot deliver.
Would you put the Affordable Care Act in that category as well?
Well, yeah, and it's a pretty good example because Governor Fallin did a study on the Affordable Care Act, selecting a Republican governor with expertise in insurance to examine how that would impact the state of Oklahoma. And that report said that it would generate over $500 million, $500 million, in net revenue over cost, that there'd be efficiencies, cost savings, and 100 to 200,000 additional Oklahomans covered by affordable health care, and over 13,000 new jobs generated, new good jobs generated. She got that report. It didn't say politically what she wanted it to say, so she tossed it away. And we lost $500 million in revenue and have had hospital after hospital in rural Oklahoma go into bankruptcy. We haven't had any of them fully closed yet, but many of them have dramatically reduced the services available to rural Oklahomans. So how would you like to live in a community where you couldn't get good health care when you needed it, where you couldn't get emergency health care when you needed it? That's just bad government.
And I think from the governor's standpoint, or that of the Republican majority of the legislature, you would hear the argument that the state simply couldn't afford what its contribution would have had to have been to fund expanded Medicaid, for example, in the state.
And actually that's not true, because you get money back in from the federal government that not only offset that, generated $500 million in revenue over a 10-year time period. So her own study said that wasn't true, that there would be a net economic gain. So we lost out on the net economic gain because of a lack of political courage to say we're going to do what's right according to our own objective information. We lost out on 13,000 jobs. 100,000 to 200,000 Oklahomans don't have health care, which means the ones who do have health care indirectly foot that bill, and we've had a crisis in a rural health care system. That's bad government. That's governing based on politics rather than based on what's best. You know, most Republican governors even have accepted the Affordable Health Care Act and recognize that it's an economic benefit. We can argue about better ways to do it, but why are we turning down our tax dollars, which is what happens when we don't take the federal money back, and depriving our citizens of health care and our hospitals of financial support? Does make sense to me.
I know Governor Kasich in Ohio has adopted expanded Medicaid, but I was under the impression that there was a partisan split, and that many Republican governors similar to ours have not opted into that.
A number of them have not, but and I could be wrong, but I think a majority of the Republican governors have opted into it. The problem is, it is partisan. We shouldn't decide issues like health care on a partisan split. We should decide issues of health care on what's going to be best for the citizens of our state. We shouldn't decide education on partisan lines. We should decide it based on what's best for the citizens. And frankly, the Republican Party has kind of given those issues over to the Democrats and said, we're not going to deal with those hard, practical issues that really affect how our citizens live. We're going to talk about things that are just bullet points, whether we can do anything about them or not.
What's the governor's race going to look like, the next governor's race? Does the Democratic Party have a good bench of candidates who might want to participate in that?
Yeah, we do have some very good people who are certainly looking at, I'm not going to announce for anybody, but you know, Dan Boren has said that he's looking at that race. You know, Joe Dorman has indicated that he's continuing to look at that. Scott Inman has indicated that he's looking at those races. All of those are very good, competent, qualified people. So we're going to have a good candidate. I hope that not all of them will run against each other and that they'll find races where we can take advantage of that talent in other spots, because only one person can get the nomination. But we're going to have a good candidate in 2018.
And who do you think that candidate would be facing on the Republican side?
You know, that is awfully difficult to know for sure. I know I'm not privy to inside information. The speculation is that the Attorney General, Scott Pruitt, will be a potential candidate, that Lieutenant Governor Lamb is looking at that Congressman Bridenstine from Tulsa may be looking at that. There have been various names that have surfaced at one time or another. So there'll be a contentious race, and I have no idea who the nominee will be.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming down to the studio today.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.